Look it up. This meeting is being recorded. Okay. You can look it up online if you want to follow up. It was updated November 25th, 2019. So her name is Barbara O'Brien. She's labeled a Zen Buddhism expert, whatever that means, and author of Rethinking Religion. So she talks about, I'm just going to read, this is one of the tricks I've learned in doing a lot of writing and studying, reading for writing and so forth, just to read the first, just the captions and then the first line or so of each paragraph. We can skip through it. Again, you can follow up yourself. Warrior monks, although Buddhist scholars say there is no justification for war in their teachings, Buddhism has not always separated itself from war. There's historical documentation that in 621, monks from the Shaolin Temple of China fought in a battle that helped establish the Tang dynasty. In centuries past, the heads of Tibetan Buddhist schools formed strategic alliances with Mongol warlords and reaped benefits from the warlords' victories. Then the links between Zen Buddhism and samurai warrior culture were partly responsible for shocking collusion of Zen and Japanese militarism in the 1930s and 1940s, and so on. It's observed from a distance of time and culture, she makes the point, these actions and ideas are inexcusable corruptions of Dharma, and any, quote, just war theory that arose from them were the products of delusion. Now, if you go into studying why the Japanese, including the Zen priests, were so resistant in World War II, you will find that this is mostly from a distance of time and culture. If you were there, you probably would have joined in the resistance as well. So anyway, is war always wrong? Another subhead. Buddhism challenges us to look beyond this simple right and wrong dichotomy. In Buddhism, an act that sows the seeds of harmful karma is regrettable, even if it is unavoidable. Sometimes Buddhists fight to defend their nation's homes and families and so forth. This cannot be seen as wrong, yet even in these circumstances, to harbor hate for one's enemies is still a poison. Hate is one of the three poisons: greed, hate, and delusion, variously translated. Any act of war that sows the seeds of future karma is still aksala. Aksala is the opposite of, what's skillful means? Upaya. It's the opposite of skillful means, in other words. So Buddhist morality is based on principles, not rules. Our principles are those expressed by the precepts and four immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, etc. So it is neither good nor righteous to stand aside while innocent people are slaughtered. And so this is the dilemma. Then under to fight or not to fight, in what Buddhists believe, the Venerable Dhammananda wrote, Buddhists should not be the aggressors, even in protecting their religion or anything else. They must try best to avoid any kind of violent act. Sometimes they may be forced to go to war by others who do not respect the concept of the brotherhood of humans as taught by the Buddha. They may be called upon to defend their country from external aggression. As long as they have not renounced worldly life, they are duty-bound to join in the struggle for peace and freedom, and so on. And Shenzhen was just on this morning with the Korean World Peace Movement group that I join once a month. So, and as a martial artist, I think Shenzhen will be able to address this next paragraph, as always, in questions of morality. When choosing whether to fight or not to fight, a Buddhist must examine his own motivations honestly. It's too easy to rationalize one has pure motives when in fact one is fearful and angry. So then love your enemy. We are called upon also to extend loving kindness and compassion to our enemies, even when facing them on a battlefield. That's not possible, you may say, yet this is the Buddhist path. And she goes on to say that some people think you're obligated to hate your enemies. Buddhist in the military is the last subhead, and this is promoting a book that you can order. Today, there are more than 3,000 Buddhists serving in U.S. armed forces, including some Buddhist chaplains. Today, Buddhist soldiers and sailors are not the first in the U.S. military. During World War II, approximately half of the troops in Japanese American units, such as the 100th Battalion, 442nd Infantry, were Buddhists. So There are 26 cadets currently at the Air Force Academy who practice Buddhism. So one of the, at the dedication of the chapel, the Reverend Dai N. Wiley Birch of the Hollowbones Rinzai Zen said, without compassion, war is a criminal activity. Sometimes it's necessary to take life, but we never take life for granted. So I thought that would be on Memorial Day or weekend, that would be a pretty good way to set the tone of the dialogue. As we know historically, these kinds of dialogues called Hosen Shiki, or Hosen means something like Mando, crossing of swords. Hosen means extended. Can't remember what Shiki means. But they were often recorded. Apparently they had people sitting around with brushes and piles of rice paper all the time. And they became what we now call the collections of koans. So the way this works is each of you steps up virtually and pose a question or a comment, and then we take that comment and respond to it. I'm going to turn it over to Shinjin for the first. If I have 2 cents to add, I will jump in after he is done.
And for Sangha, those that are not used to this is called Dharma combat. And this is where we get to ask our teachers anything.
Tough questions.
Tough questions. So those are online on Facebook. You might not have heard of this, but this is something that comes along every fifth Sunday. We have the opportunity to just present our teachers with questions. So we welcome those questions and comments. So please do not hesitate to put your questions in the comments section on Facebook, or if you're online, please make sure you just raise your hand and come off of mute and ask the question. And I got a comment. Let me go over here for cassettes. Let me pull it over here.
And we can't hit you with a stick online, so not to worry. Cosettes.
So what comes to mind for me is having served in the military when I was young and having thought about many of these questions after it was too late. What comes to mind is the balance of short-term, immediate scope decisions and actions and long-term strategic, as the notion which was quite strong at the time I served in terms of peace through strength, by deterring an aggressor through the possibility of overwhelming force and retaliation. And I'm not saying that that is a definitively appropriate strategy, but one could make the argument that in terms of our homeland, it has worked. On the other hand, you could make the argument that that led to a lot of remote suffering and skirmishes in other people's homelands. So I just am interested in that balance of waiting until you're forced into a response versus trying to prevent the need for use of force.
Well, a couple of things come to mind. We're roughly the same age. I did not serve in the military, but the year I graduated high school was the year that they reinstated signing up for the draft. The draft never happened, but I did go down. I figured, well, if I have to go, I'll go, but I'm not volunteering for this because at the same time, the Soviet Union had just invaded Afghanistan, and we thought we were looking at another Vietnam. So it's a dicey question. I think, so all of my experience with violence all comes from studying the martial arts, which I've done for over the last 30 years. And there's a concept in Japanese that doesn't really translate into English, but the word is katsu. And it gets loosely translated as victory, but it doesn't really mean victory. What it means is victory has already been decided before the fight starts, and it's been decided by superior attitude and preparation, which I think is a little different from, you know, peace through strength. But I think that I guess what I would advise anybody that asked me was, you know, be prepared if you're required to defend yourself, but don't go looking for a reason to defend yourself. You know, the great sage Isaac Asimov said in his Foundation trilogy, violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. And that's always really resonated with me. You know, I don't know of that many situations where violence was the only possible avenue. Does that help at all?
Oh yes, and I agree. I have often said this. This is always fun for getting quizzical looks. You know, it's like I'll ask, like my teenage son who's studying history now. You know, how did we win World War III? And he said, "What? We didn't have." I said, "Right, we didn't have a World War III because of the Marshall Plan. You know, where we exercised compassion to our enemies and things like that." So, I agree. But um, as well, this also brings to me the question of individual versus group action. It's on the one hand, it's easy in terms of scope, certainly not easy in terms of making such life decisions, but we can make decisions for ourselves. But then as a political body, when we need to make decisions as a political body, that's tremendously difficult to implement such plans of compassion, such as the Marshall Plan. I'm still kind of astonished that we were able to do that.
Yeah.
But I agree that kind of thoughtful engagement in the world, that kind of compassion for others, when implemented on the political level, could certainly obviate the need for violence, that last resort of the incompetent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
May you be well.
John.
Here this morning, what's coming up for me is I've been processing my increasing awareness of how the land that I occupy, I'm going to say Georgia as a whole, I'm in Carrollton, West Georgia, had a 200-year transformation from being owned and occupied by local, I'm going to call them red folks. And over a 200-year period, it transitioned to being owned and occupied by what I'm going to call white folks. And as I've paid attention to that, there was this progressive inducement, encouragement, and pressure to get the red folks out of here. Even when they said no, the necessary force that all of you are familiar with was used to get them out of here for no good reason other than a desire for more land, a greed for their land that they had occupied for arguably centuries. I want to put just a little bit of a personal face on this. And there is a question. Thank you for your patience. I was getting a haircut recently, chatting with the barber. I became aware that she was about 75, 80% Indian. I said, I'm curious, where did your Indian parents and grandparents, where do you come from? She said, a reservation out west, and she named it. And I said, did your grandparents tell you where they were before they were on the reservation? She said, yes, sir. They were here in Georgia. And it just hit me. I mean, it just hit me so hard. I said to her, we're living on your grandparents, your great grandparents' land. This was their land. As she continued to cut my hair, she said, Mr. Hinman, I'm just not able to think about that. I can't go there. My question is, as a Buddhist, is there a place for making amends for what our grandfathers did to the original owners? Is there some way of righting that kind of wrong?
Let me take this one and let Shinjin follow. The place in Zen, at least, is on the cushion. Because on the cushion is where we will realize that we don't own anything. The Native Americans seem to understand this. They occupied certain tribal territories and they would defend those from the other tribes. But I understand they kept largely the region of Kentucky unoccupied as a place where the bison herds and so forth could replenish themselves. So they were managing the land, but I don't think the concept of ownership ever entered their lexicon. That's the famous story, almost a humorous story, is that's why somebody was able to get Manhattan Island for some lousy beads, Sure, sure, of course it's yours. It's everybody's, So I think Zen recognizes, and this is not dodging the question, Zen recognizes that on an absolute level, no such ownership of land is possible. You can go for generations handing it down, handing it down, handing it down, but ultimately it doesn't belong to you. On the social level, these are matters of agreement. The language itself is an agreement. We agree that what we call my land is my land. You agree to that, even the word land. This is why Zen comes up with things like, there's not an inch of earth, there's not an inch of soil on the whole earth. So on an absolutist level, if you realize that for yourself on your cushion, then that very conundrum, John, that you're bringing to the table here, how can I own this property? You don't. And yet you do, as a social agreement. This is why I think the monks, were encouraged to give up such ideas and join the order. And yet the order was given land grants on which they could build monasteries. So the relationship of the individual to the social, or you could say the individual to the corporate, is similar to our relationship to nature in general. Theoretically, we're stewards of wildlife and so forth. But look at how badly we're mishandling that relationship. So when it comes to our fellow human beings, it's an extension of the same kind of self-driven logic. I'm not answering your question. You have to find that answer.
Thank you for responding, Sensei.
Maybe. Well, anything to add, Shinji?
I would just say that your best shot at making amends for anything is the third noble truth, the six paramitas. By striving to meet those, you're going to make the world around you better. You make your own life better. You make everybody you are involved with, you'll make their lives a little better too. And I think that's the best chance you've got. You can't undo history. And, you know, where would your stopping point be? And what could you really do? And the answer is you can't. All you can do is work on yourself to keep the future from getting worse.
It would not hurt to take on a project like writing about it, you know, engaging the social dialogue in some way. That's what most people do. And I think this is like a political question, or it meanders into the political arena. And my position is pretty clear on this. I think what we do in training people to do Zazen and to take up Buddha Dharma, to try to penetrate Buddha Dharma, is radically subversive. I think we are training armies of people to be independent thinkers and to be interdependent actors. Everybody plays lip service to that. But the other groups are not saying, sit down and shut up, you know, and you'll figure this out eventually, you know. So that's what I think is radical about what we're doing. And so when people talk to me about why am I not out protesting war, the death penalty, why am I not joining the cause du jour, the cause of the day, I don't want to represent Zen as taking that position. Zen takes a much, much more radical position. That if you yourself come to this insight that Buddha had, you yourself will know what to do in your case. And that's more powerful than any top-down movement. It's a grass-up revolution. Revolution begins on the cushion.
Thank you, John, for your comments and questions. And I'm going to tag team off of that too, because a lot of my friends and a lot of people are having this very similar conversation. And I know, Sensei, your comments are related to the absolute thinking. And I think where I went when John was asking his question is, yeah, I mean, it's understanding that the land is, no one really owns it. You know, it is a social construct, contracts and policies that hold us, but sometimes by threads, to get a overarching agreement. But in the midst of dealing with when we're living in the relative world, it's hard to kind of go at people like, oh, it's nobody's, you know, nobody really owns that. But when you're feeling the response from that barber was very interesting to me, because it's just like a lot of times I feel people that have been on the other side of it, to where they're downstream from the impact of it, it's very hard for those people to get it to look at the absolute because they're seeing so much in
All right.
the downstream effects of the things that are going on relatively. But I do, for me, I'm so glad that you did speak to the fact that it does start with you. And then I know myself with some of the conversations that I've been having with some of my friends about working with it, working with what arises. Sometimes it is overwhelming to where it's almost paralyzing the enormity of it, especially when you're talking to your people like my father and my grandmother, and you see the downstream impacts of it. You feel it, you see it. So some of my friends are getting into reparations and what does it look like, and I'm just kind of like, it's a very interesting conversation to have. But I always come back to, like you said, it's individually. What is it that arises for the individual and what is it to do or not to do, but you have to get real clear about what that is, or else you're operating from a place of delusion. So, I mean, it's a very charged conversation. So, John, when you were stating that, and I grew up in Kentucky, I'm from Kentucky, and my dad's a Vietnam vet too, so there's a lot of stuff that's whirling up in there. Um, but it's interesting coming from a Tibetan lineage, and they do a lot of work on purification and clarification, and in Zen, that's absolutely it's kind of you don't
Yeah.
see any of that. So I just wanted to again, John, tag team on your comments, and Sensei, thank you for both of them for your teaching. But it's a lot going on in that with that dynamic.
Well, let me just respond to that a little bit. In Buddha, in Zen, at least compared to Tibetan, I think, as Dogen said, what precept is not fulfilled in Zazen? So the process of purification in Zen is also the cushion, is also sitting in Zazen. That's where hopefully you'll get to the root of your own stereotypical way of looking at your reality and maybe get past it. And the thing that's gone unmentioned here is the what was called manifest destiny. I believe Sinjin is a better historian than I am. He can speak to this a little better, but it's not only that they were red people and we wanted their land. It was that we are white people and we manifest destiny says we deserve this land and they don't. And now we're celebrating the anniversary of Tulsa, the burning out of the community there. And that was not impelled by the desire to get those properties. They burned them down. It was that they were black people. They weren't white people. And they were thriving and succeeding. And we can't have that. So there's something much deeper and much more, unpleasant to look at here that was going on. It wasn't simply a land grab. And again, Zen goes to that. I'm sitting here I like to think of myself as middle-aged, although that's long past. White, middle class, Midwestern, guy. But when you sit on the cushion, that's all laughable. That doesn't mean anything. It does socially. It means a lot socially. I live an envelope of white privilege. But when it comes to the true self, as opposed to the constructed self, it's all BS. And it's impermanent. It's not going to last. Somehow manifest destiny gets coupled with this idea of bequeathing this to your heirs, and that's an ugly baby.
But isn't that the gift of this practice? Is being able to work with illusion and see things as they are and are not, and it's
Very much.
the impermanence of all things. If we can get there, it seems to be a process.
Even wills and trusts, inheritance is an effort at permanence. Do you have anything?
No,
Not going to wade into that swamp.
no, it's already been answered.
And again, I'm going to repeat this for folks that are joining on Facebook. People are coming and going, but again, this is an opportunity to ask our teachers questions that arise about our practice, about things we're working with, about anything. So please don't be shy. This is a great opportunity that we get once about a quarter. So yes, I'm good. Mm. Thank you for your service, sir.
Thank you for your service.
My question for you gentlemen is, it's nice to talk about being on your cushion and seeing things properly, but if you boil it down to just a practical situation, someone kicks your front door in and is going to attack you or kill you or whatever, and you have the means to defend yourself, are you not going to, assuming that your means to defend yourself would require killing them, would you not go ahead and kill them?
I deeply, sincerely hope I never have to answer that I'm never in that situation. I would really rather go the rest of my life and never have a violent incident in it. And that's a very sincere hope. And, so I can't predict what would happen, you know.
Isn't it true, Angan, that military training, which you've been through as well, is meant to compensate for what Shinjin just said? I mean, martial arts certainly is too. So that when you are in a defensive posture and you are under attack, you tend to react automatically. You don't have to think about it. And so if our troops were poorly trained and they were under fire, we'd probably never win a single engagement. So the training is meant to overcome this second guessing or ambivalence. If you're in the foxhole, they say there are no atheists in the foxhole, and there's probably not a whole lot of ambivalent thinking going on there either.
I would certainly agree from the point of the military that you're trained. We were trained that they aren't people, that they're targets. And if you're going to shoot a target, you take aim and you do it like you've been trained to do, but you dehumanize the entire thing. And that's easy to talk about, but when you're sitting 15 miles south of the demilitarized zone in Korea, and things are still pretty hot, you have to face the reality of that. But I was trying to get it back down to a much more personal level. I'm at home in my bed and some druggo kicks the front door in and's going to rape my wife and kill me. I'm going to defend myself. There's no question in my mind. And I'm going to not only mentally prepared to do that, I'm going to be physically prepared to do that. I think you can't just sidestep it and say, I hope it never happens and I don't know what I'll do. You need to be ready for whatever circumstances arise. So yes, I'm trained to defend myself.
Yeah. I would agree, but I'd also say you need to be prepared for whatever consequences arise. That is, it may turn out that it's a cop kicked in the door and you kill the cop.
That's true. Very true.
Go ahead, Cosette.
So that's something that a topic that we've discussed quite a bit in our extended family. And I think one of the things that we have to do is not only be prepared for the consequences that we envision, but we have to be prepared for the unintended consequences that we cannot envision. The risk if being prepared, for example, includes keeping a loaded weapon readily available. What are the risks that grandchildren will find it? And, you don't have to look far into the statistics to see how much harm is caused through those unintended consequences.
And my question,
No, I would just say that even becoming a monk or nun and living the celibate life and dropping out of family life does not sidestep this issue. Because history in China, there were all of these many incidences where the warriors would come to the monastery to try to capture an enemy who's taking sanctuary in the monastery, and the monks had to go out and confront this. And the famous story of Shaolin and Bodhidharma teaching the monks karate, how to fight with an empty hand against weapons, shows the history of Zen has been like this, the history of, so there's really no escape. I think that's one of the tenets in Zen. We would wish for a better world, but again, the only revolution from the Zen perspective, I think, is that if everybody, and according to the report I just read, it looks like more and more people in the military are Buddhist. If everybody in the world took up something, it doesn't have to be Buddhism, but something like Zen meditation, where they became peace within themselves, and it's possible that you could literally have world peace, and then this for the first time would not be an issue. But as long as humans are caught in ignorance, and as Buddha taught, there's no escape from it.
again, thank you for your questions on that one too, because I mean, it's something that every situation is different. And where does compassion and intent kind of fall into those scenarios? I think that you're talking about compassion and intent and wisdom too. It's all of that. But
Yeah.
me in a certain situation, Ungen in a certain situation, it could look different and it'd be totally different outcomes.
Yeah.
So can you speak a little bit about that, Sensei? Elliston, either one.
Well, I would just say compassion means suffer with, and we don't want to interpret compassion as being, if you're being attacked, you want to be so compassionate with the person who's attacking you that you don't defend yourself. That's not
right.
That's not compassion. That's stupidity.
Mm-hmm.
And compassion is that if you pull a gun on me and you're coming at me with it, and I pull a gun on you, we're in this together, and we may both die. We may both be wounded. That's the true meaning of compassion, is that we're all suffering with this together. The aggressor, as one of the commentators pointed out in this paper I read, you don't want to be the aggressor in Buddhism. But if necessary, you will be the defender.
I was hoping you would get that definition of compassion. I've heard you say that because I it's a shared responsibility.
It is. Yeah. The most compassionate thing sometimes looks like cruelty, tough love, Shinjin-san?
Again, come off mute for us. Come off mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm old and forgetful too. One of the Jataka tales, as much as you want to believe those things, the Buddha's out on the ferry and the thieves get on the boat ferry and they're methodically lining the people up, robbing them, killing them, and throwing them overboard. So how does the Buddha react? He kills the bad guys. Now, why did he do that? Now, his motives were pure, and that's supposed to be the message in there is your motives. You're not doing this because you hate other people, but you're doing it to defend yourself and other people. Plus, he had another great one, little idea, says, and he was really doing the bad guys a favor because by killing them, they couldn't build up any more bad karma for themselves. So it's really good to kill the bad guys. No, I don't mean that now. That's a joke.
The Native Americans had a similar take on this that I read about. One of the chiefs was quoted as saying all of the braves and squaws and children who had been killed by the invading white colonialists would be reborn as their children, the ultimate revenge. So that has a similarity to what we mean by karmic consequences through the three times. I'm a little concerned we have two, go ahead, Angan, but I think we have 2, 3 people who haven't said anything yet. And
I was going to say Corolla's got her hand waiver up on automatic.
Oh,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. June, Corolla?
I'm going to start out by saying that Sri Lanka and Myanmar are not exactly good advertisements for the good behavior of Buddhists.
All right.
So we can't get on our high horse and say, wow, if everybody was just a Buddhist, the world would be much better. We have to accept that. But this, in a way, ties back to the story of the Trail of Tears, in that when we say the repentance, all my past and harmful karma, that's part of it. Born of beginningless greed, anger, and delusion. And we are where we are because of this beginningless greed, anger, and delusion. And if we're being attacked, it's because someone else is in a karmic web where they feel they've been wronged or they have the right to attack you because of their being embedded in this web of greed, anger, and delusion. So we have to always accept that. Sitting on the cushion is very well, but we have to, I think, balance that with the Bodhisattva vows as well, to sit on the cushion to find the best way to not perpetuate this cycle as much as possible.
Right, right. So I'm not pushing back here, but I'm agreeing with you in a different way. I don't consider myself a Buddhist. So I don't think that Buddha was not a Buddhist. But the point I'm making is not that the Buddhists, we may have less of a history of violence, but you can be a Buddhist in name only, just as you can be a Christian in name only, or Muslim in name only. What I'm saying is what Buddhism points at, which is a relinquishment of our self-striving grip on reality. If everyone could come to that kind of insight, I think it would do a lot to ameliorate the suffering around the world.
Buddhism is not something that you are, it's something that you do or practice better sometimes than at other times. I never or try to avoid identifying as a Buddhist, but rather say that I practice Buddhism to the best of my ability.
Yep. We take up the way of. So Brendan, did you have something? Calling you out now.
Yeah. I'm no historian. I have no formal training or anything, but it seems to me that, violence has been constant for the duration of human history and probably preceding human history. It's never really stopped. And it seems to me, as long as greed, hate, and delusion are part of humanity, and so far they always have been, there's no realistic chance that, one day all violence across the world will magically cease. Maybe we can reduce it, but we're going to have to deal with this stuff. And it just seems to me that it parallels the Bodhisattva vows, which kind of by definition, at least on the surface, seem impossible to me, to free numberless beings to end inexhaustible delusions. We'll never get there. And so I was hoping you could comment on that. What is our responsibility in the face of this seemingly overwhelming problem?
Well, it is not your responsibility to fix everything, but it is your responsibility to at least start the work. You are responsible for that. I think in a lot of ways that's what karma is. But you can't forget the fact that humans evolved to live in bands of 50 to 100 individuals that we were all nearly genetically identical to. And any outsider was there to take our access to water and food, or steal our mates, or was carrying diseases we didn't have immunity for. So that's the roots of this violence. And our closest relatives, chimpanzees, do the exact same thing. And so we're at a point in our history where that kind of behavior is no longer an advantage. Millions of years ago, it was. It's what kept us alive. It kept the tribal unit together and ensured your offspring would survive in the next generation. We don't live like that anymore. And so these modes of violence are about as useful as wisdom teeth and an appendix. It's things that we've evolved out of. And I just think as a species, not enough of us realize that we've evolved out of it, and how maladaptive it is, and how it's only going to make things worse and worse and worse. There's too many of us to live like that anymore, and resources are too scarce to do that. And it's not up to us to fix it. And it does seem hopeless. It does seem like a finger in a hole in a dike. But at the same time, you don't have any any choice other than to try and make things better, make your own life better, make your own self better. And I think that's the point of what we're trying to do here. That's why you stepped onto this path. And I think that one of your desired outcomes should be harmony with other people. And violence is not that. Violence is the exact opposite of that.
I would just add to that, violence is inherent. It's a given. When you breathe, you're violently killing millions of microbes with each breath, and that's violence to them. So it's only a matter of direction. Where do you direct the violence? Against what? And if you look at the tribal thing, what Shinjin is pointing out as usual is the broader picture of the science is that the species wants to evolve to generate hybrids that are more capable of surviving in the future. So the thrust of the sexual thrust of the species for reproduction is to increase the gene pool, not to limit it. And even in 150 people, that's a pretty limited gene pool. That's where all the recessive traits come out. And maybe violence is a recessive trait, who knows? Yeah. But if you look at what's happening in the world today with the nationalism and the populism and the politics playing this, one group off against another, the overall trend of the species would be to unite as a common species around the world and take advantage of the biggest gene pool in the world. But the people who are resisting that don't think that way. So this is where it gets back to Buddha's 12-fold chain. It begins with ignorance. The ignorance that we're born into is kind of a universal, innocent ignorance. Trees are ignorant. It's not their fault. But then it can become willful ignorance. And you can want to be the leader of your tribe. And then you start competing with people within your own tribe so they can't displace you as the leader. So it turns against itself. It becomes neurotic or even psychotic. So again, on the cushion, I think we can transcend human nature, which is that nature which is wanting us to strive with even with each other, like the chimpanzees attacking each other for no apparent reason, external reason. And that's why I say Buddha, when Siddhartha Gautama became Buddha, he transcended humanity. That was the peak, like any branch of mathematics. He transcended the axioms of humanity. So he was no longer in the same class or species, you could say. In the Jataka tales, they illustrated this by saying he allowed himself to be eaten alive by a starving lioness so she could feed her cubs. I mean, you know, if you're going to let yourself be eaten by a lion in order to save that species, I don't think you could be called human anymore. So when we say human nature, we put it on a very high pedestal, but I don't think Buddhism does. Buddhism says human nature is like, you know, this self-nature, competitive, survival. So Katsuri, you're the only one who didn't say anything, but did that cover anything well for you, Brendan? Or touch on anything?
It did. Thank you.
I'll, if I can add, this gets me thinking. I have a couple memories of Matsuoka that I want to share. I wasn't really prepared to talk about Memorial Day or some of these other things per se. In Long Beach, he always, at the back door, there was a wooden, I don't know what they're called, but it was a wooden sword.
It's called a
And-
boken.
Yeah.
What?
Boken.
I
Boken?
never talked to him about it. I never saw him pick it up, but it was always there. So, you know, he was prepared. I don't think it was there for any other reason than that he may have to use it. But it's interesting to me that it was like this wooden sword and not a, you know, semi-automatic. He was going to keep the level of, it was going to do the job, and he knew how to use it. And the other memory I have of him is on Memorial Day. This was never mentioned, or I mean, he never said anything about it, but he and Ray usually would go to a cemetery and chant some of the sutras. I never quite understood why, you know, and he just did it. He didn't really talk about it. But it makes the lack of, because it was an American cemetery and he was probably chanting to all beings, or, you know, there was a lack of bitterness. He had served in World War II. A lack of, you know, hatred of any sort that he displayed. He just went to chant the sutra in a cemetery, out of honoring whoever he was honoring, or paying homage, you know, to however he was doing it. And I admire the privacy of it, you know, just him and his chanting. So it's not really a question, but that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Sensei Shinjin, can you speak a little bit about, do you know anything about the wooden swords at all?
Yeah, the wooden swords has a very long tradition. That that's what they in Kendo. That's what they train with a bamboo stave, but the wooden sword was made predominantly a training device, but because the Japanese sword, while being very, very sharp, is also very brittle, and so you didn't want to break a very expensive brittle sword training, so they trained with wooden swords. And I've got one in my closet next to my front door as well. But the Musashi, the guy that wrote
Musashi.
the Five Rings, he actually won several duels with a wooden sword, because he knew that if he hit his opponent's sword just right, the opponent's sword would shatter. And you know, it's a good heavy. They make them out of oak, so yeah, you could do a lot of damage to another person with a wooden sword. It's not a toy.
I always have a fantasy of grabbing the kitchen knives, you know. I'll throw all these kitchen knives and kill the guy before he can shoot me. And you might have seen the film, it was The Seven Samurai, where
No, it's
the guy
wonderful.
trains in throwing the knife, you know, after he's been wounded, falling leaves, he's pinning the falling leaves. And the young Japanese guy has a 6 Colt revolver, like a Colt, you know, Western gun. And they're going into battle, and he throws the knife and hits him right in the wrist, makes him drop the gun. And everybody now has swords, so guess what's going to happen?
Right.
But you got to be good.
I bet.
Well, you know, all of this martial arts that I've studied, the technique that has gotten me out of more trouble than all the rest of them put together is just go, hey man, whatever it was, I apologize.
Yeah.
And
Walk
that
away.
works like a charm.
Walk away. I think that movie was a metaphor about Western technology, weaponry, how the better weapon technically does not necessarily always win. But what we see now is kind of this hyperventilation about, you know, I have to have the semi-automatic rifle to defend myself because that guy may have a semi-automatic rifle. And so it's just the international arms race, you know, on a personal level.
John.
Hearing this, I'm reminded that locally our police chief makes it mandatory that everyone that comes into the department, new as well as those there, have to review a program called verbal jujitsu. And when you threw up your hands and said, I apologize, that's one of the basic approaches. And I talked with one of the former police officers who had been with the program for 20 years. And because we were close, I dared to ask him, how many people have you killed in 20 years? And he said, none. And I was surprised because I knew he was out there. And he said, John, in 20 years, I've actually drawn my pistol from the holster twice. And I said, how do you do that on the street? And he said, I live by this motto: my approach determines their response. That came up when you, sir, when you mentioned that powerful response of, I apologize.
I just thought you could put it in text or in the chat. Her name.
Thank you for sharing that, John. And Katsuryu, thank you so much. I'm always, when anybody that has had like the interaction with Matsuoka Roshi or Kongo Roshi or Sensei Elliston, you know, it's always interesting to hear some of that interaction because it always brings some insight. So we really appreciate y'all sharing those stories. So, but John, I wish that a lot of other police departments, you know, hopefully aspirationally that they'll develop some of that training for their staff, because again, training and resources are critical. I feel, you know, it's a way to be able to work with what comes up. It's just another tool in your tool belt. I'm glad to hear that that's being done. Sensei Roshi.
I had a question for Brendan. He just came back from Australia, and I just wondered if you noticed any difference in Australia along these lines.
They have fewer guns, and so
They being the police?
Yeah. Well, in Australia generally, there was a mass shooting, I think, in the 90s. And after the mass shooting, they passed pretty sweeping gun legislation and said the police are less scared, uh, all the time about maybe this guy I pulled over in the car is going to have a gun. Uh, my girlfriend, who's a black woman, felt a lot more comfortable there. So it's definitely a different environment. That was the main difference I noticed.
So what would you say to the trope, only the criminals will have guns?
I think if you look at the statistics, gun reform works. It just does. Um, New Zealand passed gun reform, and most of the weapons got handed in. Australia passed gun reform, and most of the weapons got handed in.
Yeah.
If it works, then it works.
I think that was true in New Zealand too. They had one mass shooting and they just clamped down everything everywhere. That's what I heard anyway on the report.
Brendan, I remember reading, I think it was about 20 years ago, when Australia went through this disarming process. And part of it was they actually the government purchased in a buyback program, literally hundreds of thousands of handguns. And one of my local associates said, this is not going to go well. Once they get the guns, the government will then start taking away their freedoms. I've listened, but I haven't heard about anything other than positive results. Is that your experience with Australia as well?
I definitely didn't feel any less free in Australia than I did here. I think when we talk about, freedom in America and the Second Amendment, it's kind of because we haven't completely ruled out as a country a violent overthrow of our own government, which is sort of how the country was founded. But Australia isn't any less free. They're a functional democracy. People vote, people have rights. The law is respected at least as much as here.
And I will thank you for that, Brendan, for your insight. Even when he was in Australia, we tried to keep in contact, so we got pictures and everything. But we're glad to have you back stateside. I don't know if you're glad to be back, but we're glad to have you back.
No, it's wonderful to be back.
All his comments were upside down, though.
That's exactly right. So, do we have any questions from the Zendo? I'm not calling anybody out, but there's somebody sitting in the back there.
Space. Can you hear me? The my question was going to be, of course, on time, but it no longer seems timely. So I have a different comment. First, Albert Einstein was the one who said, I don't know what weapons will be used for the third war, but the fourth world war will be fought with sticks and stones. So this is more a thought than a question in reference to what Brandon said, which is, do you feel any less free because you've turned your guns in? I actually feel less free because there are guns. I feel my suffering's increased. My degrees of freedom are decreased because guns. In fact, quite the opposite. I feel less safe. So that's my attachment to worry about not feeling safe. Thank you both for your comments and your teachings today.
You be well.
Interestingly, one of our members just sent me the, what is it? The big book on the Vedic war. Krishna, or Arjuna is fighting the war because he doesn't want to fight because he's fighting against his own tribe and so forth.
Bhagavad Gita.
The Bhagavad Gita, thank you. And I've read it before in ancient history, but this is a brand new, they call it a radical translation. So one of our guys is from in East India, and he wants me to read this so he know I can discuss that. I'm interested to see the origins. They say Buddha was a kind of reformer. He was in the warrior caste, as we know, and he apparently brought back some of the Vedic practices into proto-Hindu India of the time. So it's going to be interesting to see what this book has to say.
And I'm going to do a time check. So we have like 7 minutes. So I'm going to ask um, Hojo Sensei and Shinjin Sensei for any final comments or questions about the topic for today, and then we'll move into our announcements and our closing Dharma verses. So, Sensei Shinjin.
Uh, all this speaking of violence and fighting, just hope may you all be well.
I have a question for Shinjin. He was on the Korean World Peace Initiative this morning, and he was accompanied on the panel by an imam representing Islam.
Yeah.
And the subject was not about jihad or war, what we're talking about here, but it was about trees, things of that nature.
Mhm.
But what would you say, your understanding of jihad from the Islamic perspective and how that relates to the discussion we've had?
Yeah, I'm really not an expert on this at all. There are probably much better people to ask. And being raised Jewish, I've got a cultural bias to overcome that I've been working on quite a bit. I've read a few things on the history of Islam and the biography of Muhammad. And, in some ways it seems kind of exploitive to me to whip a bunch of people up into a religious frenzy to get them to be violent. It seems like bad moral calculus in some ways.
Yeah. The thing that strikes me, and I think it came up in I've been with this Korean peace movement for over a year now. I think I'm their longest running panelist now. And it was something about jihad being actually a personal struggle. It's not a social struggle. And that's the closest thing I could think of to overcoming the constructed self, realizing the true self, etc. The jihad is actually internal, apparently according to the original teaching.
Again, as always, for Dharma Combat, we always have interesting and discussions. But senseis, thank you so much for your teaching. Sangha, thank you so much for your teaching as well. Your questions, your insight is always very helpful. So again, Gasho, everyone, thank you so much. Just a few quick announcements that we have. Again, congratulations to Hojo Sensei again on his book with the, is it IPPY? Am I saying? Is it
IPPY, 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 the
So
IPPY
we'll-
Awards,
We will be-
independent publishers.
So if you haven't gotten a copy of Hojo Sensei's Original Frontier, please do get a copy. We leave a review. We'd appreciate that. That helps, again, support our teacher and also support getting the information back to the center. We are also taking that book up as our reading on the Thursday Dharma group. So please check that out if you can. Next Sunday, we have Sanki talking about Dogen. So that's always a pleasure. And then the next Sunday, we have Tomon, Dr. Lisa Marr coming in to speak about compassion fatigue. She was an internal medicine physician on a COVID unit within COVID. So it will be very interesting. And she does a lot of writing on compassion, and her work on compassion will be interesting to hear that. We also have coming up, we have Sogetsu coming in residence in June, as well as we will be having Ungen back in July. So we have some exciting opportunities to be able to work with some of our priests in residence. And as always, please check out our offering online. There's always, as we're thinking, and we'll get information updated to the website about reopening opportunities. Please watch out for that. We'll send that out. And again, if you're not already a consistent giver, we appreciate if you consider becoming one. And if you're already one, we are so grateful for your offering. So without further ado, Tojo Sensei.
COSET's in
COSET's.
September. COSET's
Yes.
is in September.
Oh, yes. And last but not least, Kosetsu Randiero will be here. We're so excited about that as well, that we have so many opportunities with our priests coming in to be with us. All right. Any last comments or questions? All right, everyone, be safe, be well through the holiday weekend, and we will ask Shikaku to bring us into our closing Dharma verses.
Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it.
Thank you for your presence and your practice. Keep on sitting, and we'll hopefully see you sometimes during the week. Enjoy your vacation and get some rest. God show everyone.